Tensions involving Iran have once again exposed the fragility of global energy markets, with Africa often feeling the shock most sharply. I'm Beatrice Marshall from CGTN, and welcome to this special edition of Talk Africa, co-produced with Kenya Television Network, KTN.
And I'm Dennis Aseto from Kenya Television Network. Now, this crisis is reigniting urgent questions about Africa's energy future. Despite vast oil, gas and renewable resources, hundreds of millions across the continent still lack reliable electricity, while many countries continue exporting crude and importing costly refined fuel. As Africa expands refining capacity and invests in new energy infrastructure, can the continent build a more secure and self-sufficient energy system?
So this week on the program, we examine Africa's paradox, why the world's most resource-rich continent remains vulnerable to global energy shocks, and what lessons can be drawn from the latest crisis.
To help us unpack Africa's current energy reality and whether the continent can move from vulnerability towards greater control and resilience, we are now joined by our panel of experts. Here with us, Job Okanda, climate and development expert. We also have Mwendia Nyaga, co-founder and chief finance officer, OML Africa Logistics. Asanteni sana for joining us in this program, and welcome.
Thank you.
Mwendia, let me start off with you because today global attention is focusing on the Straits of Hormuz and the disruption of global oil and gas flows. What is the extent that Africa has been impacted by this? And when you look across the continent, what is unfolding? What are you seeing?
Well, Africa is a net importer of petroleum products. Despite it producing quite a bit of crude oil, it imports most of its use because the refineries that are there are not enough to produce what Africa actually needs. So we export crude oil from Africa, and we then import refined products for use in Africa. So the tensions in the Middle East are therefore directly impacting the continent. And you cannot discuss this without first looking at the fuel prices that people have to pay, because that was the immediate impact when the invasion of Iran happened on February 28th. And so the increase in prices then spiral into increasing prices of everything else, including price of transport, and therefore prices of goods and services. People are having to pay more. And so now entire economies are now spending much more in importation bills, and therefore draining the much needed foreign exchange that they need to fund other products. So necessarily the import bills are now higher. Some of the currencies are now starting to depreciate, meaning that people have to now pay more for their debts, especially the national debts. And so it's basically then hitting the entire economies of Africa.
Yeah. Now, Job, when you talk about Africa's energy mix, we see it's different because we're still net importers of fossil fuels. Now, what does that speak to in terms of region by region basis, and which countries then are highly exposed when it comes to the violence or the differences that we see from the Middle East?
The energy mix is not uniform across the continent. When you look at North Africa, for example, countries like Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, they mainly depend on gas to power their energy systems, although Morocco is a little bit different because it has a higher percentage of renewable energy. When you come to the southern part of Africa, it's mostly coal dependent, especially South Africa, which is one of the main economies that is coal dependent. East and Central Africa, we see quite a high percentage of renewables, mostly geothermal, as it is the case in Kenya. You see hydros. So that's the case of the energy mix across the continent. But you find that that does not in itself mean that you're energy independent, even if a higher percentage of your energy mix is actually from renewable energy. And this is because, yes, our grids That's energy mix in our grids, but most of our services, whether it's production, whether it's transport, it's still fossil fuel powered. And that's why we're being impacted in the way that we are today by the war in Iran.
Namwanda, there is now the question that comes with Africa, which accounts for a significant portion of resources. So here we're talking about global energy and mineral resources, with more than 20 countries producing oil and many other producing natural gas. Now, is Africa truly energy poor, or are the deeper challenges tied deep in infrastructure, investment, governance, and integration?
The problem with Africa is not energy poverty by all means, because there's abundance of resources, as you have said it. Africa is producing at times up to 10% of world crude oil production. And looking beyond crude oil, the whole of the Sahara and most of our countries, even here in Kenya, there's abundance of solar energy that is hitting the ground surface every day. There's abundance of wind energy that is also available just about everywhere. And beyond that, we have abundance of, say, hydro energy available, especially in countries like Ethiopia and DRC. They are said to be having capacity to supply the entire energy needs of Africa if they could utilize the hydro capacity that they have. Back here in the Rift Valley, we have geothermal energy, again in abundance, all the way coming down from Djibouti, down the Rift Valley through Kenya. And this is the eastern side of the Rift Valley, which goes up to Tanzania. And then the western side of the Rift Valley also in western Uganda, western Tanzania, going down all the way to Malawi and Mozambique. So the energy supply as a natural resource is there in abundance. What Africa has not done is to convert these into energy for use. And that's, like I had said earlier, even the crude oil that we are producing, we are not converting it into petroleum that we can use. Even the refining capacity that is already developed in Africa is almost always producing other capacity. So what, therefore, is the problem here is the conversion. And Africa needs to move into a stage where it can convert this energy and use it.
So that brings me to that question, Joe, because if Africa is not energy poor, and if Africa is lacking the refining capacity in terms of crude oil, where is the challenge? Why does Africa look like it keeps lagging behind when it comes to solving the energy crisis for the continent?
I think one of the things that this crisis has actually exposed is those fault lines, and it has exposed the kind of model that has kept us energy poor. I think it's not a technical issue, it is a design issue. And we, as a continent at independence, we inherited an export-oriented model, not an industrial model. And that's why most of the value is not generated on the continent. Look at a country like South Sudan, extracts a lot of crude, exports it to the Middle East for refining. It's a landlocked country, imports back through Kenya via land back to South Sudan. And when you look at the energy crisis, actually, in South Sudan, it exposes those fault lines that we see. We've seen also with the attempts to actually build refineries on the continent. We saw it with Dangote refinery in Nigeria, and we can see the challenges that Dangote Petroleum refinery is actually undergoing. When that refinery was completed, he could not access local crude. He had to import crude from Brazil, from Angola to be able to refine. And that then leads us to the question, who actually owns these resources? We've seen multinational corporations, Total Energies on the continent controlling vast majority of these resources. We saw the challenge when they were negotiating the Uganda crude oil pipeline, for instance. The Ugandan government was pushing for a refinery to be built, but Total Energies pushed for a pipeline to the coast. And so it means just extracting and shipping them for use by someone else. We saw it in the Africa Forward Summit, for example, when a discussion around green industrialization, And the CEO of Total Energies actually said the European refineries need Africa's natural gas, for instance. This in itself exposes the kind of economic models that we have. It's based on extractivism. It's not based on adding value within the continent. And that in itself needs to awaken African leaders. We cannot continue just exporting crude and importing refined oil.
Let me follow up on that, Mwandia, on the point of refining capacity. With the introduction, for instance, of the Dangote refineries and the other refining capacities of Northern Africa, would that be enough to assist, to help Africa in its refining capacity challenges?
It's not enough, but if it's utilized optimally, it can actually go a long way. For example, the Dangote refinery, with a capacity of 650,000 barrels per day, can supply Nigeria's entire petroleum demand, because their demand currently is about 500,000 barrels per day. Still remain with some balance of 150,000 barrels per day that can be exported. And in this crisis, actually, we have seen that refinery first starting to operate at full capacity, which has never happened since it was commissioned. And number two, actually starting to supply some petroleum needs in other parts of Africa. Part of that has actually come all the way to Tanzania. Some of it has gone to Zambia. So that is significant. But if you look at the refineries in North Africa, for example, Egypt is operating at 50% capacity at this time. Libya is also operating at just about that 50% capacity. So there's quite a bit of installed capacity, which I would say can go up to about 60% of what Africa needs. To go beyond there, then we need more investment. And clearly, you can see the eastern side of Africa is the one that is most challenged, because even the refineries that operated there, like in Kenya, Tanzania, and there was Zambia also, all of them closed down because they got outdated with old technology. More investment is needed to be able to cover the demand.
Wendy, I want to follow up still with matters to do with the vulnerabilities that Africa finds itself in, because we have resources here, but decisions around fossil fuels and production or even development of the same are done outside the continent. So you talk about OPEC Plus, you talk about major, huge oil producers, and those decisions being made out there, how does it then speak to energy independence that the continent must or should have?
Yeah, I think once we have chosen to be importers of our energy requirements, then we have also chosen to be affected by the decisions that are being made out there. With this energy transition that has been going on, basically meant to deal with the climate change, Africa can utilize the benefits arising from that in a completely different way. The energy transition is, for example, has accelerated the development of what is called the e-mobility for the electric vehicles. I already see now in Nairobi on the streets, you can see a lot of electric buses there. So we should start moving towards, say, conversion of our transport sector. In Kenya, 80% of the petroleum imported is used for transportation. Okay. Now, in the meantime, we have geothermal energy buried in the Rift Valley, which we are not using. So if you would make some conversion, and it is not a short-term kind of a solution, it's a long-term solution, and apparently energy is, there's never really a short-term solution to energy needs. But if we could convert, say, like our transportation to electricity instead of petroleum, then it means we would use our God-given resources that are there today and save the much-needed foreign exchange. And that's where the policy needs to start going. Ethiopia is already doing it and actually has passed it as policy that certain kinds of vehicles will not be imported as internal combustion engines. They got to be electric.
Yeah. I mean, Job, even discussions that you're talking about going green, energy transition and all that, right? It is a conversation that is being held, but remember, resources as well that develop batteries, because you talk about green energy batteries, still extracted from the continent, developed outside, then we import the same. Are we having discussion about intentional investments for us to secure the independence that we talk about?
Yeah, and that is, it speaks to how Africa can leapfrog, you know, the kind of energy systems that it inherited by, and how Africa can also deal with its own internal challenges. Energy transition provides an opportunity for Africa to create jobs for its people. You know, if we are able to manufacture the lithium batteries that we talk about on the continent, we're adding value, we're creating jobs for our people. We are reducing the over-reliance on external production. And that's what, you know, I think the Dangote should be thinking about, because fossil fuels are not the energies of the future. It's renewable is the energy of the future. And we should start investing in the future. Our governments, the little resources that they do have, I think instead of investing in short-term fixes that maybe provide a political opportunity, we should start thinking long-term. You know, just imagine today how much our governments are spending to subsidize fuel. You look at a country like Senegal, for example. The Minister of Finance announced that they'll need 2 billion more to subsidize fuel. If that 2 billion would have been invested in a wind project, for example, in a solar project, for example, you're building resilience of your communities, you're securing energies for your communities, you're providing clean cooking for your communities, instead of just subsidizing an industry that has undermined Africa's development by taking away all the resources, taking away the value that would have been added within the continent. So it's about time that countries start thinking in that direction and looking at where does Kenya have, for example, comparative advantage? Where does Uganda have comparative advantage? And starting to collaborate in that particular manner.
On that note, let's take a short break, and when we return, we continue exploring the challenges and opportunities shaping Africa's energy future. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Talk Africa, co-produced with KTN. Well, let's continue our discussion on Africa's push for energy independence and the structural changes needed to secure the continent's energy future. Well, still with us, Joab Okanda and Mwendia Nyaga. Mwendia, how do you see countries, though, benefiting from sourcing refined fuel across the continent?
You know, one of the biggest benefits of expanding the refining capacity within Africa is that at least the African countries would stop being affected negatively by actions of others far away from the continent. So this expansion and should focus perhaps much more on the sub-Saharan Africa and mainly East and Southern Africa, because the West Africa and North Africa have a fairly developed capacity. Is that the supply shocks that are hitting African countries every time there is an issue, especially in the Middle East, those ones would reduce. However, I would want to warn that this does not necessarily lead to lower oil prices, because the petroleum prices are being determined internationally. So you'll find that even countries which are producers and are self-sustaining, unless they are giving subsidies to their people, which is not usually recommended because it distorts markets, unless they're giving subsidies, then you'll find that even those countries would be selling to their consumers at higher prices. However, Number one is that the supply is available and is not interrupted. And then number two, those who are producing crude oil as a country would also get to benefit from the increased revenues. So I am for expansion of the refinery, but also just as strongly, I am for diversification of energy sources.
So I want to put this to you both, and Joab, just continuing on that thought of line that financing is not going to fossil fuels, it is going to renewables. On that note, though, and I would also like your comment, Mwendia, should the continent leapfrog to renewable energy as of now?
For Africa, it's about enabling our own development. It's not about leapfrogging. It's not about transitioning from dirty to clean. It's about our own development and looking at it in terms of how do we develop in a way that avoids emissions, and in that way, structuring our own industrial policies with that in mind, with the kind of financing that is flowing in mind. I think we're able to, if you have to use your word, leapfrog, and leapfrog from lack of energy to access to energy.
Right, Mwendia?
Yeah, I think Africa at this stage is sitting in a world where a lot of investment is being made in the technologies for the renewable energy. And that investment is happening because of climate change. Fair enough. But Africa doesn't have to exploit that because of climate change. Africa has an enormous abundant supply of wind and solar. And it is time for Africa to take advantage now of that development in the technology and be able to provide energy to people even at the most distant places. Mm-hmm. Whereas investment in, say, like power transmission is expensive, mm-hmm. It is time to take advantage of, again, these technologies and even, if necessary, develop mini grids of being supplied by solar energy and by wind. The time is now for development of the renewable energies in Africa, and time is now to try and reach people using unconventional means, mm-hmm. As opposed to just saying we got to connect them with a long transmission line and put them in the national grid. National grid is important, don't get me wrong, but there are still those pockets which we really don't have to wait for this investment to be made, because locally they have some natural resource available in terms of sun, in terms of wind, which can be exploited today. The technologies are improving and they're getting cheaper, so it becomes much easier to invest in this.
So how important, as we talk about infrastructure, renewables, and the future of Africa's energy, how important is cross-border cooperation and intra-African energy trade? How important is that for the future, particularly now with the coming up of the Africa CFTA?
Yeah, trading within the continent, especially in the energy sector, is really, really key, because you cannot have abundance to become self-sufficient. As I said before, we need to look at where we have comparative advantage. If I can produce hydro to supply the region, let me focus on production, and then let the other countries focus on transmission. But this requires also building trust among countries, It's the lack of trust that exists within the continent, across governments, across countries, that makes us trade with the outside world. We seem to trust the outside world more. So in the energy sector, we have to build that trust. Mm-hmm. I have to trust Ethiopia that whenever there is an issue, they'll not cut off the supply mm-hmm. to Kenya. And that in itself, will make the issue of regional power pools a reality. Because we are not creating these regional power pools just for the sake of it. We are creating regional power pools so that we are able to trade the energy that we need. And I think the Africa Free Continental Trade Area is one of the enabling factors in this particular energy, cross-regional and cross-border energy trade.
And finally, to both of you gentlemen, I want to ask the question then, if global energy shocks continue to hit the continent as is, what does that mean for the future, and what lessons must governments then learn for us to say that the continent is independent and energy secure?
coming back to what the governments need to think about, I think number one is storage. You find that whenever we talk about strategic reserves, we are talking about Europe and America. Africa does not have stocks to last for more than a month, almost in any country. So we need to think how can we store a bit more so that it can take us a bit longer to suffer from the effects. So there must be investment in storage. It's expensive. The stocks are also expensive, but sometimes cheap is perhaps the most expensive. Yeah. Now, number two, and it has just been mentioned by Job, is the cooperation between the different countries in Africa. There needs to be policies, and these are cross-border policies that enable us to be able to supply each other. It's good to see that almost every region in Africa now has a regional power pool. There's a Eastern Africa power pool, there's South African power pool, which apparently is the one that works best currently. There's West African power pool, there's North African power pool. But we find that the interconnectivity is still not yet done. You would be surprised that Egypt currently has just been given the chairmanship of the Eastern Africa power pool, but Egypt's power grid is not yet connected to the rest of Eastern Africa. So there are steps that are still continuing to be taken. And I think there's also an initiative, which is an AU initiative, of now interconnecting all these power pools, such that Kenya may be running out of electricity, but could draw from somewhere in West Africa because the grid is somehow interconnected and this trade starts to happen. So that's and then there will be the investment in trust, because people are still looking at sovereignty and thinking that if I am reliant on DRC for my power supply, then that means my country is not truly sovereign. There needs to be a lot of investment in that, and also harmonizing the laws and regulations to ensure that what is being produced here can easily be taken to the other sectors.
Yes, Job.
I think just to add on to what Mwendia has said is the need for governments to invest in electrification, especially of our major transport corridors, because we know that the transport sector, is the one that takes up majority of the fuel that we import, and so to reduce the reliance, we need to electrify our public transport, but also our major transport corridors. You can imagine if we electrified the transport corridor from Mombasa to South Sudan or to DRC, how much of the fuel we will save. So that's really important. And the impact, as you asked, Dennis, is that the impact is not just on the prices alone. We know that fertilizer, we get fertilizer mainly from the Middle East. It's a byproduct of fossil fuels. This is going to impact on the farmers. We need to start seeing, less reliance on fertilizer agriculture, fertilizer-intensive agriculture, and maybe start promoting agroecology that is self-sustaining. So the impact is not just on the prices of fuel. The impact is on the entire economies of the continent.
Thank you, gentlemen, for an insightful discussion. As the continent rethinks refining, infrastructure, and regional cooperation, the question is no longer whether change is necessary, but how quickly Africa can build systems that work for its own realities and priorities. Next week, we continue the conversation by exploring how Africa can diversify its energy systems and build a more resilient energy future.
Well, that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa, co-produced with KTN. A big thank you to our guests, Job Okanda, climate and development expert. Also, Mwendia Nyaga, co-founder and chief finance officer at OML Africa Logistics. Well, remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall.
And Dennis Aseto.
And the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's goodbye.